During the company party, when the band was playing a romantic classic that we had often danced to in our living room, I asked her to come with me to the center of the room. She smiled awkwardly and shook her head lightly. I thought it was shyness or tiredness, but when I insisted, she responded with a light laugh and a sharp look, "My boss dances better than you." At first I thought it was a joke, something sarcastic, but there was something in her expression that left no room for misunderstanding. Her eyes, once so familiar, now reflected a strange glow, of someone who had already crossed the line of respect, complicity, loyalty. That was not a joke. It was a confession. At that moment, the music disappeared, the laughter around seemed to dissolve into the air, and all that was left was the muffled sound of my heart beating in an irregular rhythm. She looked away and went back to talking to him, as if nothing had happened. He, of course, pretended indifference, but there was an implicit tension in every gesture, as if he were trying to contain his superior smile. That dance he offered her a few minutes later was just a formality for the rest of the room. For me, it was the final nail in the coffin of our story. There were no explicit caresses, but anyone who knows the gestures of those they love recognizes when they no longer belong to them. I left the party alone, still hearing, like a distorted echo, the band's melody and the muffled applause. In the elevator, I looked at myself in the mirror and realized that something inside me had died. A part that, until that moment, had naively believed that everything was fine. I called my lawyer before I even took off my jacket. My hands were shaking, not from anger, but from a kind of sadness that consumes me from within, that silences me. I told him that I wanted to start the process. I didn't ask for advice. I simply said, I want a divorce. And quickly. He understood my tone and didn't ask any questions. She had no idea that what seemed like an ordinary night to her would be the night that would change everything for me. That her thoughtless words would be the key that would open the doors to my freedom. She would come back from the party believing that everything was under control, that she could continue playing that game of seduction hidden behind knowing looks and deleted messages. But there would be no going back from that night. She danced as if she were free, but they forgot to tell her that you don't abandon someone in the middle of the dance floor and expect the music to stay the same. In the early hours of the morning, lying in my empty bed, I revisited all the moments when I was the only one rowing that boat. The trips I didn't go on, the gifts I prioritized, the silences I accepted so as not to hurt anyone. I remembered the Sundays with my family, the inside jokes, the conversations before bed, the early mornings when she cried and I hugged her. And in all these memories, there was only one face present, mine. Because deep down, she hadn't been there for a long time. And the cruelest thing about all this is that she didn't just cheat with her body. The betrayal started long before, with her disinterest, her silent absence, her subtle comparisons, her monosyllabic answers. Every empty, okay, every cold, I'm tired, every, we'll talk later, was a step towards distance. And I, blinded by love, kept pretending it was normal. That it was a phase. That it was just work, just stress, just time. What she didn't know was that while she was playing with the illusion of control, I was about to turn the key. Not out of pride. But out of survival instinct. Because there comes a time when even the deepest love understands that it must die for dignity to survive. She came home late that night, still smelling of the other man, believing that nothing had changed. She came in smiling, like someone carrying secrets that tasted like adventure. She asked where I was, and I answered with a look she had never seen in me before. Cold, direct, resolute. I simply said, I called the lawyer. And at that moment, she realized that she was no longer the one in control of the narrative. Her lips trembled, her eyes sought refuge in the corners of the room, but there was nowhere left to run. The house of cards had collapsed, and she was the only one trying to pretend that she could still hold it together. She cried. She asked to talk. She said it was just a joke, that it wasn't what it seemed. But it was. And she knew it. She felt it. And so did I. All the time. Her justifications were disorganized, fragile, desperate. You're exaggerating. It was just a comment. It didn't mean anything. But it did. Because those who love don't diminish. Those who love don't compare. Those who love don't dance with someone else while their partner watches, bleeding inside. In the days that followed, she tried to turn things around. Tickets on the table. Ready-made lunches. Sweet messages. As if it were possible to erase with pampering what had been destroyed by choices. She began to show affection that she hadn't felt in months. She laughed at my jokes. He would touch my arm in the kitchen. He would look at me for a long time while I read the newspaper. But what she didn't know was that I was no longer there. The man she thought she controlled with the crumbs of attention had left that night, in the hotel elevator, while she was dancing with another man. She went into crisis. She sought out friends. She confided in her mother. She cried in the bathroom. And in the midst of all this, she found a letter I had written a few weeks ago, tucked away in my drawer, with no intention of it being read. It was a draft of vows that I intended to use for a renewal that I was secretly organizing. I spoke of forgiveness, of starting over, of how I still believed that we could be happy. I spoke of a trip I was planning to celebrate our wedding anniversary. A romantic destination. The tickets were already purchased. I had booked the room she had dreamed of, with a sea view. And that was what destroyed her inside. The morning after the reading, she came to me with swollen eyes and shaking hands. She told me she didn't deserve this. That she had been a fool. That she had destroyed the only man who had ever truly loved her. And she was right. The difference was that now it was too late. My heart had already healed on the outside. And though it still bled on the inside, the pain was a distant memory. I had chosen to move on. Today, she lives with the memory of what she lost. I, with the certainty that I survived. And it all began that night, in that room, with that song. With that look in which she told me, without saying it, that she was no longer mine. But what she didn't know, is that, in the end, she herself would write the epilogue of our story. And that the true climax was yet to come. Welcome to the channel. Here, we never support any form of betrayal. The stories told are fictional, but they carry deep truths. The objective is clear: show how betrayal corrodes, destroys, and leaves deep scars on the soul of those who truly love. Get ready to dive into another intense narrative, full of twists, pain, choices and consequences. Now, take a deep breath, and prepare to hear a shocking story. Jonathan and Emily always seemed like the kind of couple that people looked at and thought, they met at the right time. There was something sincere about the way he would adjust her coat on cold nights, or how she would still make him tea the way he liked it, even when she was tired after work. They had been together for 9 years, married for 6, and every detail of their life together seemed to have been carefully planned to work in harmony. He was analytical, soft-spoken, with that look that preferred to take in the surroundings before speaking. She was extroverted, charismatic, the kind that charmed with her spontaneity. Where he was cautious, she took risks. Where she soared, he anchored. They were, in essence, a balance that inspired admiration in the eyes of others. They lived in an apartment on the 8th floor of a modern building, overlooking a square surrounded by old trees. Jonathan liked to sit on the balcony in the late afternoons, with a book on his lap and the sound of birds filling the silence. Emily, on the other hand, spent these moments taking care of the plants that she spread throughout the rooms. It was almost a habit: each new place they lived became a vertical garden of life. The apartment, decorated in light tones and with affectionate objects, breathed memories. The blue blanket on the sofa, a gift for their first anniversary together. The black and white photographs of their trip to the coast, hanging on the wall in the hallway. The photo frames with notes exchanged over the years, small gestures that marked everyday life with tenderness. Jonathan worked in technology at a digital solutions company. He had always been passionate about logic and systems, but he never lost his sensitivity to human relationships. He had a natural talent for understanding people, listening slowly, and giving balanced advice. His co-workers trusted him not only for his competence, but also for the calmness with which he dealt with any problem. Emily, on the other hand, worked in the marketing department of a multinational company. She was ambitious, determined, and had an admirable capacity for argumentation and leadership. She had a unique brilliance in meetings, an almost hypnotic ability to captivate people, and although this sometimes provoked jealousy in competitive environments, she knew exactly how to position herself. This made her a reference in what she did, and, in many moments, the pride of Jonathan. They met by chance, in a bakery line. It was autumn, and she complained about the wait while he laughed discreetly at her impatience. They exchanged quick words, then smiles, and then, without warning, they started running into each other more often in the same neighborhood. Emily always said it was fate. Jonathan believed in probabilities, but with her, he let himself be carried away by the feeling that certain things didn't need an explanation. When they finally went out together for the first time, there was no game, no insecurity. Everything flowed with a naturalness that was scary at first, but enchanting over time. Their life together did not start out easy. Emily had come from an abusive relationship and carried invisible scars. Jonathan, on the other hand, had been betrayed in the past and was slow to trust her. But over the months, they built a safe space together where their previous pain no longer needed to live. He learned to deal with her silences, and she learned to understand his fears. Over time, what was care became habit. What was habit became partnership. And the partnership, a kind of calm love, that did not need euphoria to be true. They had fixed routines, but they were never monotonous. Dinners on Fridays with background music, TV shows on Sunday nights with blankets and popcorn, walks in the park on Saturday mornings. In between all this, there were deep conversations about the future, about children, about old age. They were in no rush, but they dreamed together. Jonathan spoke with emotion about living near the sea when they retired. Emily imagined a house with a garden, dogs and afternoons reading in the backyard. They were simple dreams, but they were shared. And that made all the difference. Their family adored them. Jonathan's parents saw Emily as a daughter at heart. Her brothers said that Jonathan was the only man who could be there for her without trying to change her. Friends called them the perfect couple, the kind that balances humor and affection, that fights and makes up hand in hand. They weren't perfect. They had their disagreements, their periods of distance, their nights when they slept in silence. But every time, they knew how to come back. They had the maturity not to run away from problems, and the tactfulness to resolve them with respect. Emily, despite her strong personality, listened more than she spoke when they were in conflict. Jonathan, despite being reserved, knew how to apologize when he made a mistake. They learned to find each other even on cloudy days. Emily had been growing rapidly in the workplace. She had been promoted 2 years earlier and, since then, she had been attending corporate events, trips and get-togethers more frequently. The routine had changed a bit. Their schedules began to clash, their schedules became tighter, and they couldn't always have dinner together like before. Jonathan understood and always said he supported her in everything. Sometimes I would stay up late just to see her walk in the door and tell her about her day. Other times, I would leave notes on the fridge and flowers in the living room just to remind her that I was there. Emily seemed to respond with similar gestures, although at times, her tiredness showed more than usual. Still, there was never any pressure. They respected each other's space as if they understood that freedom is also a form of love. Over time, new people began to become part of Emily's life, especially due to changes in her professional environment. Jonathan didn't mind. He knew that her world required connections, networking, and public exposure. And he trusted her. He wasn't the controlling type. He was the type who believed in the daily choice to stay. He didn't monitor messages, he didn't question every step. He just observed. And he loved. Emily, on the other hand, didn't talk much about her colleagues. Sometimes she would mention names in casual conversations, upcoming events, or alignment meetings with the board. She never gave any signs of anything other than professional. And even when she was more absent, she made up for it in the details: a surprise dinner prepared, a loving compliment in the middle of the day, a lingering touch when passing him in the hallway. Time passed, and they reached their 6th wedding anniversary with a private dinner at home, candles lit, wine and shared laughter. Jonathan toasted the woman of his life. Emily smiled emotionally. They exchanged glances that still carried the weight of what they had lived and the lightness of what they still believed they could live. That night, as they danced awkwardly in the living room, he thought that perhaps they were ready for the next step. Not a child, yet. But perhaps renewing their vows, celebrating again, in another place, with new meanings. The world still seemed safe at that moment. Love, still strong. Over the next few months, Jonathan began to quietly plan a trip to celebrate their 10th anniversary together. He wanted to surprise her, choose a special place, prepare something symbolic. Meanwhile, Emily seemed increasingly involved with her work commitments. Travel increased, meetings outside of normal business hours, last-minute events. Jonathan missed her, but he convinced himself that it was just a phase. Work demanded it. And she was growing, shining, taking up the space she deserved. Silently, he rooted for her. Silently, he waited for her. And it was in that interval, between calm and torpor, that everything began to change. Subtly, like the cracks that appear before a structure collapses. First, in the longer silences. Then, in the hurried kisses. And then, in the glances that didn't meet with the same intensity. But Jonathan, believing in the strength of everything they had built, refused to interpret these signs as a threat. For him, love was also waiting. It was insisting. It was trusting. Until the day when, in a seemingly banal gesture, during a company party where everything seemed like just another ordinary celebration, a simple phrase lit a light that he could no longer turn off. A phrase said with an ambiguous smile, somewhere between a joke and a confession. A phrase that would echo day and night in his mind, opening a hole where there had once been certainties. But until that moment, until that instant, he still believed. He still dreamed. He was still hers. Without knowing it, he was already heading towards the end. Without imagining it, he was about to discover how fragile love can be in the hands of those who forget to care. Emily started leaving home earlier and earlier. She claimed that there were meetings with the new board, internal mergers, and dynamics between departments that required her constant presence. The routine changed subtly. Little by little, she stopped having coffee with Jonathan on Saturday mornings, started responding to his messages later, and started showing impatience with the trivial conversations of everyday life. The tone in her voice changed, as if the affection that had previously been automatic was now calculated. Jonathan noticed, but he looked for logical reasons. He preferred to believe that it was fatigue, that it was all part of a new professional moment that would require temporary adjustments. He had faced similar situations in other years of their marriage, moments when one of them needed more space and the other offered support. This time, it was no different. He decided to be understanding, offering silence when she wanted rest and presence when she felt exhausted. He didn't make demands. He kept bringing her flowers on random dates, sending voice messages wishing her luck before performances, and making her favorite meal when she said she had a busy day. He expected her affection in return in small acts, but these became scarcer day after day. There were days when Emily would come home smiling, as if she had experienced something intense and satisfying. On those nights, she would eat dinner in silence, take a longer shower, and fall asleep quickly, with her back to Jonathan. He couldn't explain the discomfort he felt, but it was as if she had returned home with her soul somewhere else. As if her body was there out of obligation, but her mind was wandering in territories that no longer included him. He told himself that he couldn't hold on to paranoia. That relationships went through phases, that mature love knew how to overcome turbulence. He believed in this so much that, even when he found a gift package in her car that he had never received, he preferred not to ask. He suppressed his discomfort with a smile, hugged Emily tighter that night, and decided to trust her. But something there began to hurt silently. One afternoon, while organizing the month's bills, Jonathan noticed a series of expenses at restaurants that were not part of their usual routine. Expensive places that Emily had never mentioned in their usual conversations. When he asked her naturally, she replied that they were corporate lunches, normal for the position I hold now. Her explanation came quickly, impatiently, as if the simple act of asking was an unjustifiable gesture of distrust. He backed away, felt naive for having asked, and decided not to bring up the subject again. But it wasn't just her schedule or schedules that had changed. Emily had changed her perfume, the way she dressed, even the shade of her makeup. She was more vain, more in tune with her image, more active on social media. Jonathan noticed these changes with the eyes of someone who still loved her, but he was beginning to see the shadow of an inevitable distance. Corporate invitations came in. Dinners, cocktail parties, annual events. Emily said it would be great for him to go, that they could have fun, take the opportunity to escape their routine. But at many of these events, she seemed more restless, less comfortable in his company. At one of them, she chatted with work colleagues while Jonathan watched from afar, holding a glass of wine and trying to find a look in her eyes that would include him in that environment. When he finally approached her, she said with an almost cynical smile that he seemed out of place in that environment. Jonathan laughed, trying to hide his embarrassment, and replied that she was glowing, as always. Emily thanked him with a kiss on the cheek, and returned to the conversation circle, leaving Jonathan standing in the middle of the room, like an unnecessary guest. The nights were silent again. The messages were short. And even when they were physically together, it was as if an invisible wall had been built between them. Jonathan looked for ways to get through this wall. He suggested trips, suggested breaks from work, tried to revive old habits, but she always said that now was not the time. That she was under pressure. That she needed to focus. He, once again, understood. What he couldn't understand was why she no longer bothered to hide her disinterest. It wasn't just a lack of affection. It was coldness, it was haste, it was emotional absence camouflaged by convenient justifications. On a rainy afternoon, Jonathan prepared a simple dinner, lit the room with candles and played soft music in the background. He had bought a special wine, the kind they had drunk on their anniversary trip 2 years before. He was waiting for Emily with a strange feeling between anxiety and hope. When she walked in, her face tense and her eyes glued to her cell phone, she stopped when she noticed the scene. She forced a smile and asked what they were celebrating. Jonathan replied that it was just dinner, like old times. She dropped her bag on the couch, came over and said she wasn't hungry, that she had eaten something on the way. Dinner was served, untouched. Jonathan spent the rest of the night washing the dishes in silence. Over time, she began to notice patterns. Messages were answered more quickly during business hours than on weekends. Phone calls were made from the bathroom with the door locked. Clothes he had never seen before were now appearing as if they were part of his routine. Casual comments about her new boss, an articulate, respected man from whom she had learned a lot in the last few months. Jonathan had never been bothered by Emily's success, quite the opposite. He was proud. But he couldn't ignore the almost reverent tone in which she spoke of this man, as if he represented a new universe to which Jonathan did not belong. The invitation to the company's end-of-year party arrived by email. A gala event, reserved for employees and their companions. Emily insisted that he go, despite his initial resistance. She said it would be important for his image, that all his colleagues would bring their partners. Jonathan accepted. He rented a new suit, got a haircut, and got ready as if he still believed he could reverse the distancing. When he arrived at the event, he noticed the exchange of glances and the hidden smiles, as if his presence there was a reason for surprise. Emily, however, looked stunning. She wore a long dress, impeccable makeup, and had the posture of a star. She introduced Jonathan to his colleagues cordially, but without enthusiasm. He felt like a supporting actor in a play in which she was the absolute protagonist. During the night, he watched her move around. She danced, toasted, smiled easily. At one point, he asked her to dance. They were playing soft music, and he extended his hand kindly. Emily hesitated. She looked away. Then she smiled humorlessly and replied, in an almost playful tone, but with subtle venom, "My boss dances better than you." There was laughter all around. One of her colleagues tried to lighten the mood with some random comment. But Jonathan didn't laugh. He just looked at Emily. And for the first time, he clearly saw something he had refused to accept until then: she no longer respected him. She no longer admired him. She no longer chose him. It wasn't the phrase itself. It was the way it was said. It was the provocative glint in her eyes. It was the disdain disguised as a joke. And, more than that, it was the naturalness with which the others around her accepted it, as if it were something they already knew. Jonathan said nothing. He simply walked away, returned the glass to a waiter's tray, and walked to the elevator. On the way, he glanced back and saw Emily smiling. Not at him. But at the man she had been talking to. A man who was holding her arm familiarly. A man who was not her husband. That night, there was no fighting, no shouting. There was no confrontation. Jonathan walked home, alone, and in silence. He sat on the couch, took a deep breath, and called his lawyer. His tone was calm, but it carried a definite firmness. He wanted to start the divorce proceedings. He said he would explain everything in person. The lawyer simply replied that he would be available the following morning. Jonathan hung up, took off his jacket, and looked at the photograph of their last wedding anniversary. He smiled sadly and turned his back on her. Emily arrived home hours later, believing he was asleep. She left her shoes at the entrance, walked straight through the living room and went to her bedroom. Jonathan didn't say a word. The next morning, she found him dressed up, ready to go out. He politely said good morning. And then he left. No kiss. No explanation. No drama. Emily just watched the door close. Something about it felt off. Something had changed. She didn't know it yet, but the consequences of her choices were about to invade her life with a force she could never have foreseen. Jonathan left the lawyer's office with the documents in hand. Everything was ready. All he needed was his signature and Emily's for the process to officially begin. In the car, with the windows closed and the engine off, he remained motionless for minutes, staring at the envelope on the passenger seat as if observing the wreckage of an entire life. It was more than just paperwork. It was the formalization of an end that had begun quietly, advanced subtly, and was now falling hard on everything he believed in. The feeling was ambiguous. On one hand, relief at finally taking a concrete step. On the other, a kind of pain that didn't hurt his body, but seemed to weigh on his bones, as if every part of him was exhausted from resisting. Still, there was something Jonathan needed to do before he could hand over those papers. That same night, he came home early. Emily was in the shower. The house was quiet, with the lights partially on and a soft scent of lavender in the air. He walked upstairs calmly, passed through the half-open bedroom door, and with a calm look, simply said he wanted to talk. She wrapped herself in the towel, surprised by the calmness in his tone. She asked if everything was okay. Jonathan said yes. "Everything is as it should be," he replied. She frowned, but didn't comment. She dressed quickly and went down to the living room where he was already waiting for her with a hot coffee on the table. They sat facing each other. There was something in his posture that she no longer recognized. A kind of firmness without anger, of absence without hurt. As if, finally, he had stopped resisting. He began by saying that he had filed for divorce. He said it calmly, without raising his voice or making a big deal out of it. Emily froze for a few seconds, then crossed her arms and tried to maintain control. She asked if he was taking it seriously, if it was final. He confirmed it. He said he was at peace with the decision, but that he wanted to do it respectfully. That he still saw her as someone important in his life, even though their life together had come to an end. She tried to argue. She talked about the difficult time they were going through, asked for more time, said that it wasn't what she wanted. Jonathan listened to her until the end, without interrupting, and when she finished, he simply said that he needed to show her something. He stood up and found an envelope in the drawer of the bookcase. He handed it to her. Inside was a copy of the documents and, together, a handwritten letter. Emily read the first few lines carefully. They were old words. She recognized the handwriting. It was the letter Jonathan had written months before, when he was still planning to renew his vows. In that letter, he spoke about starting over. About a love that, even in silence, still pulsed. About the desire to see her smile like before. She brought her hands to her mouth as she recognized the intentions of those words. He had planned to surprise her. He had tried. He had believed. And now, he was delivering it to her like someone who delivers flowers to a grave. Emily cried, without hiding it. The tears fell heavily, not from anger or defense, but from guilt. She tried to justify herself, but he interrupted her. Not aggressively, but with a calm gesture. He said he already knew everything. That he had seen it in her eyes long before he heard anything. That her silence was crueler than a confession. But then, what was pain became something else. Jonathan was silent for a few seconds, then he leaned back on the couch and said, in a more restrained tone, "There's something I discovered that you need to know." Emily looked at him confused, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. She asked what it was. Jonathan then told him that, days after the party, when he had already decided to move on, he received a call from an unknown number. It was the boss's wife. A direct woman with a choked but firm voice. She said she needed to talk. She knew what was going on. That it didn't surprise her, but that there was something Emily didn't know. Something that would change everything. Jonathan met her in person, in a discreet cafe. And there, she revealed the secret that Emily never imagined. The boss, with whom Emily had been involved, was not only married. He was also in a relationship with another employee at the company, a newly hired intern. And more than that, this man was being investigated internally for unethical conduct in the workplace. His wife, who had access to the emails and conversations archived in a backup that he never knew she kept, showed Jonathan a series of messages exchanged between the man and several women at the company. There was no love. Not even respect. It was just a sequence of manipulations, empty promises, and a cheap game of seduction sustained by the power he exercised over his subordinates. Emily was just one of the pieces on his board. And worse, he commented on her with mockery in the messages, made jokes about her passionate behavior, said that it was too easy. Jonathan didn't reveal everything at that moment. He handed over just one sheet. A printed copy of one of those conversations. Emily read it. She recognized the sender's name. She recognized the language. It was his. And there she was, described in vile words, reduced to a caricature of what she had believed she lived. Her hands were shaking. Her breathing was short. She tried to deny it, then tried to minimize it. But there was no more room for excuses. She had given herself up, betrayed herself, abandoned the people who knew her best, and all of this for a man who had never truly respected her. The ground disappeared beneath Emily's feet. She fell to her knees, put her hands on her face, and cried with the fury of someone who feels betrayed by their own betrayal. She asked why he had waited so long to tell her. Jonathan replied that he needed her to feel, for herself, the weight of what she had done. That sometimes, silence teaches more than confrontation. And that now, she would have to deal with two losses, that of the husband who loved her, and that of the illusion she had built with another man. She also said that she no longer felt anger. She felt pity. Because Emily was better than that. She had potential, she had soul, she had strength. But she had chosen the shortest, shallowest, cruelest path. Emily tried to get closer. She tried to touch his hand. But Jonathan stepped back. He said that there was a limit to everything. And that there, in that moment, he finally understood hers. That there was nothing left to be saved. That love could not survive where there was no truth. And that even if she repented, as she seemed to do now, it was no longer up to him to repair what she had destroyed. She begged him. She said she didn't know, that she couldn't imagine. That if she had known, she would never have, but her voice was swallowed by tears. Jonathan stood up, walked to the door, looked at her one last time and said that he hoped that one day she would be able to forgive herself. Because he had already freed himself from the guilt. Now it was up to her to live with the consequences. And then he left. Without shouting. Without slamming doors. Only with the weight of a final goodbye. Leaving behind a silent house, a devastated woman and a story that, although it had begun with love, now ended with the hardest lesson of all: some choices cannot be taken back. And some truths only come to light when it is too late. The days that followed were marked by a silence that no sound could fill. Emily began to avoid mirrors, as if there were something more than reflections in them, as if every corner of the house held echoes of what had been destroyed. The envelope with the printed sheet remained on the table in the living room, untouched, as if it burned when looked at. She didn't have the strength to keep it, much less to throw it away. It was her sentence, her distorted mirror, proof that what she thought she could control was actually consuming her from within. Deep down, the image of Jonathan leaving wouldn't leave her mind. Not because of his departure itself, but because of the way he looked at her before he walked through the door, steady eyes, full of something she couldn't define until then. It was, perhaps, dignity. That which she had lost long before the betrayal was consummated. She tried to write to him in the following days. Countless messages that began with "I'm sorry" and ended in nothing. She deleted everything before sending it. She turned the phone on and hung up before the second ring. She walked in circles around the house, through her memories, through her own mistakes. She searched for signs of a return in the details, anything that indicated a gap, a tiny possibility. But there was no more. Jonathan had disappeared from her routine with the same precision with which he had erased the traces of the love that had once united them. He changed address, quit his job, disappeared from his usual places. It was as if he had decided to start over from scratch, far from her, far from everything that had hurt him. Meanwhile, the truth about the man for whom Emily had risked everything began to spread. The company's internal investigation, which she had been completely unaware of, came to light with merciless speed. The betrayed wife, now ex-wife, handed over the entire dossier to the legal department and the ethics board. Several women, previously silent, began to speak out. Messages were leaked. Internal groups exploded with rumors. And in a few weeks, that man's name went from being admired to becoming synonymous with shame. He was fired, exposed, and suddenly left town, carrying with him the label of predator, and no longer leader. Emily, who until then had tried to remain neutral in the midst of the hurricane, was called to testify. She sat face to face with members of the board and had to recount intimate details that humiliated her irreversibly. She realized there that it was not only her marriage that she had lost. It was her credibility, the trust of her colleagues, her self-respect. One afternoon when she came home from work, she found her own mother sitting in the building's waiting room. She had traveled to see her. The reception was cold. Emily hesitated to hug her, as if her daughter's shame could contaminate her mother. The conversation took place in painful pauses. The mother, who spoke few words, was direct. "What have you done with your life, my daughter?" Emily broke down. She confessed everything, from beginning to end. She talked about how invisible she felt, about how she believed, even for a second, that she could be admired again. She said she had made a mistake, but that she had never wanted to lose Jonathan. And she heard from her own mother the phrase that pierced her like a blade, "You didn't lose Jonathan, you lost yourself." After that, there were no more words. The mother left that same day. They didn't fight. They didn't argue. But in that silence was embedded the harshest judgment. On the other side of the city, Jonathan began to write a new chapter. He rented a small apartment, far from anything that reminded him of his old home. He went back to school and picked up hobbies he had left behind. He signed up for a photography course, something he had always loved but never had time to dedicate himself to. It was during this course that he met Helena, a discreet woman with a calm gaze and a shy smile. She had also been through a breakup and bore scars that recognized his own. There was no rush between them, no hasty promises. Just sincere conversations, long walks and a kind of affection that builds slowly. With Helena, Jonathan didn't need to hide his pain. He spoke openly, and she listened to him with every word as if she were looking into a mirror. Their relationship grew at the right time, without fantasies, but with presence. Emily, on the other hand, began to get sick. Not physically, but on deeper levels. First came insomnia, then loss of appetite, then crying fits in the middle of work. She was told to take a leave of absence. She spent her days staring at the ceiling, reviewing dialogues, remembering scenes, and wondering when she stopped being herself. One day, unable to bear the guilt, she wrote a handwritten letter to Jonathan. Not to win him back. Not to beg. But to say that she understood. That she accepted. And that, if she could go back, she would have done everything differently. She put the letter in a plain envelope, with no return address, and left it at the reception of the old building where he lived. She didn't know if he still lived there, but she needed to free herself from that anguish. Jonathan never replied. And Emily never knew if he ever read it. Months passed. Life slowly began to reorganize itself. Jonathan and Helena were seen together at an art exhibition, smiling, holding hands. Emily, on the other hand, returned to work, amidst the sidelong glances, but she no longer responded. She kept a low profile, started therapy, cut her hair, and redecorated her apartment. Above all, she wanted to rebuild herself from the inside out. One afternoon, as she was leaving the clinic, she crossed paths with Jonathan for the first time since their separation. They were on opposite sidewalks. He was walking calmly, accompanied by Helena. Emily stopped. The world stopped. Jonathan saw her. Their eyes met. She gave a slight, almost imperceptible smile. He returned it with a discreet wave and kept walking. There was no drama. There was no reunion. Just the silent acknowledgement that they had both gone in different directions, and that time, even if relentless, also heals. That night, Emily returned home and looked at herself in the mirror for the first time without feeling ashamed. There was still pain, but now it was the pain of someone who had learned. Of someone who had lost everything but had been given the chance to rebuild herself. Betrayal was no longer the center of her story, but the turning point. Jonathan, in turn, lay down next to Helena and, before going to sleep, looked out the window and murmured, "Peace has the sound of the right silence." She didn't answer. She just held his hand. And in that gesture, without words, there was everything he had always been looking for. Emily learned to live with the sound of her own regret. There were no more comforting voices, no external justifications to soften what was now unbearably clear. It wasn't just the pain of loss. It was the shame of having given her heart to someone who didn't deserve it, of having abandoned someone who had carefully constructed each gesture. She no longer tried to understand what she had felt for her old boss, or why she had let herself be carried away by easy words. There was something worse than that, realizing that at no point had she been loved back, that what she had mistaken for passion was just manipulation disguised as attention. And when that truth set in, there was no one else she could blame but herself. Not for wanting more from life, that was human, but for having destroyed what was already enough, for having crossed limits in search of validation that would never come from that place. In her therapy sessions, she spoke little during the first few weeks. She avoided saying Jonathan's name. She avoided saying any name. She limited herself to short sentences, but her gaze always revealed what was missing in the words. Little by little, she began to revisit memories with a new perspective. The way he would wait for her to arrive for dinner, the details of the notes he would leave on the mirror, the nights when, even when exhausted, he would listen to her vent about problems at work. Simple, everyday things that she had previously interpreted as part of the routine and now recognized as rare gestures from someone who loved deeply. That was what hurt the most, knowing that she had held a rare love in her hands and had not been able to protect it. Realizing that, in search of something more exciting, she had exchanged fulfillment for emptiness. The awareness of this did not come with drama. It came in long silences, in lost gazes while the city moved around her, in nights when sleep would not come because the past remained awake inside her. Jonathan, on the other hand, took this new phase with the lightness of someone who has been through the worst. He didn't talk about Emily. I didn't avoid the subject, I just didn't carry that part of my life with the same weight anymore. He had found a new rhythm with Helena, who didn't try to take up anyone's space, who didn't demand anything more than what he could give. It was a calm love, born from pain and transformed into presence. There were no comparisons. There was room to breathe. He still carried marks, of course. But now they were scars, not open wounds. Jonathan no longer needed to explain himself, or seek meaning in what he had been through. He learned that some events don't require understanding, only overcoming. And that dignity, when preserved, is the only thing capable of saving someone from the abyss. Despite this, he didn't forget. Not out of bitterness. But because forgetting would be disrespectful of what he had experienced. Emily was part of his story. A beautiful part, to a certain extent. And even though the end had been cruel, it would be cowardly to erase everything. So sometimes, when he passed by a place where they had been together, he allowed himself to remember. Not with pain, but with a kind of mature melancholy, like someone rewatching a film who already knows the ending but still recognizes the value of the plot. Emily had to deal with different views at work. The company's investigation had left its mark, even after her former boss was fired. She was not formally punished, but her trust had been shaken. Her colleagues became more distant, their smiles less spontaneous, and conversations were interrupted when she approached them. She soon realized that she would need to start over somewhere else. She resigned. She used her savings to open a small design studio, an old dream she had always put off. It was a modest space, but there she could start over, far from the accusatory looks. In the silence of that place, among colors, canvases, and projects, she began to rediscover a forgotten part of herself. She did not seek redemption in the eyes of others. She knew that would not come. What she was looking for was some kind of peace. And it was in this process that the dilemma began to emerge within her. It wasn't a dilemma about winning Jonathan back, that was already lost, but about how she could look forward without clinging to guilt as an identity. How to move forward without denying what she had done, but also without living as if she were condemned to pay for it forever. I wanted to find a balance between responsibility and forgiveness. The therapist said that forgiveness is a place that can only be reached when the pain stops asking for punishment and starts asking for learning. But Emily was still walking between the two. One day, she felt ready to move on. The next, she was back in the guilt. It was a cycle. But at least now, it was a conscious cycle. And awareness, even though painful, was the first step towards rebuilding. An unexpected invitation arrived late one afternoon. It was a local photography exhibition, where one of the featured artists would be Jonathan. She hesitated. She didn't want to seem intrusive. But something pushed her to the place. She arrived discreetly, dressed simply, and stayed at the back of the room. Jonathan's photos spoke for him. Images of abandoned places, open windows, frozen silences. Each image seemed like a piece of his soul exposed, and Emily, observing, recognized something familiar in those images. Jonathan was there. Alive. Whole. Rescued. And somehow, that relieved her. Knowing that he had managed to start over was painful, but also comforting. Because despite everything, she wanted him to be happy. Even without her. She didn't come closer. She just watched from a distance, and left before it was over. But that night, when she went home, she didn't cry. For the first time in months, she didn't cry. There was a new kind of feeling taking shape inside her. It wasn't euphoria, nor was it sadness. It was maturity. The realization that you can't go back, but move forward with what you've learned. The betrayal, the disrespect, the mistake, they were all part of her now. But they weren't all she was. Not anymore. Jonathan received a letter weeks later. It was handwritten, with firm, calm lines. Emily thanked him for everything, for who he was, for everything he had offered. She said she didn't expect a reply, or contact. That their lives had taken different paths. But that he would always be a good memory, even in the midst of the tragedy that separated them. Jonathan read it in silence. He folded the letter carefully and put it away. He felt no anger, no longing. Only respect. And in that gesture, he understood that the cycle was closed. There was still one last dilemma, not for Jonathan, but for Emily. An invitation from an old friend to do a volunteer project in another city, far away, where no one knew her. A chance to start from scratch. Indeed. Far from the past, far from the consequences, but also far from what still connected her to who she was. Was leaving an escape or a liberation? He didn't know yet. But he knew that this decision would define the next chapter. He didn't want to rewrite what he had lived. He wanted to write something new. He just didn't know if he was ready. The night before the trip, she walked around the house and touched objects as if saying goodbye to a life. She closed her bags slowly, looked out the window and thought about everything that had been left behind. She woke up with her bag ready by the door, her heart restless and her eyes more firm than ever. It was not forgiveness yet. But it was the beginning of freedom. And that, perhaps, would be more than enough to start over. Emily didn't go. Her suitcase remained closed, leaning against the door, like a symbol of a decision not made, a step that stopped millimeters from the floor. That morning, when she saw the sun flood the room with a warm, faint light, she felt that there was still something that needed to be resolved before she left. A conversation, perhaps. A gesture. Not with Jonathan, that was already resolved within her, but with herself. With the woman who still felt captive to everything she had lost, as if she were living a dormant version of who she once was. She spent the day walking around the city, not with purpose, but as if she were trying to decipher her own thoughts on the streets. She sat on a park bench and watched couples pass by, children running, dogs playing freely. She watched the world go on unhurriedly, without interruption, as if it were telling her, without words, that time doesn't stop for anyone. It was then that she made a decision. Before leaving for a new city, she needed to go back to the beginning. She needed to see for the last time the apartment where she had lived with Jonathan. Not to try to find him, but to understand if it was really possible to end the cycle. The next day, she went to the old building. The doorman still recognized her, even with her shorter hair and less heavy gaze. He asked how she was, and she responded with just a friendly smile. He said she would like to go upstairs to get a book that she might have left behind, some excuse. The apartment, now empty and for sale, was available. She went upstairs alone, with measured steps and a racing heart. When she opened the door, he felt as if he were entering a memory capsule. The silence inside was different, heavy, full of memories. The walls, now bare, still held ghosts of conversations, laughter and, later, muffled arguments. She walked slowly through the space. She touched the walls as if she wanted to absorb everything that was, and everything that was no longer. She stopped in front of the bedroom mirror and for the first time in a long time, she looked at her reflection honestly. She saw someone who had fallen, yes, but who had also gotten up. Someone who had made mistakes, but had not run away from the consequences. Someone who, despite the pain, had not hidden. Emily sat on the floor of the living room, where there used to be a blue rug and a sofa that used to be her shelter on movie nights. There, alone, she spoke out loud, not to Jonathan, but to herself, about everything she needed to get off her chest. She asked herself for forgiveness. She forgave the version of herself that had betrayed, deceived herself, and hurt. And for the first time, she felt she was ready. Not to forget, but to move on with ease. Meanwhile, Jonathan was going through another kind of challenge. His relationship with Helena was still going strong, but it was now entering a more delicate phase: prolonged cohabitation, adjustments to daily life, silences between one conversation and the next. Helena was understanding, but she also demanded the truth. And it was one night, after a simple dinner, that she sat across from him and, with firm calm, said that she did not want to carry the shadow of a previous love. That she understood everything he had been through, but that, if they were moving towards something real, they needed to start from a clean slate. Jonathan took a deep breath, remained silent for a while, then held her hand across the table and said that there was something he still needed to resolve. That it was not with Emily, he no longer felt anything for her, but with a part of him that was still on the defensive, as if expecting to be betrayed at any moment. Helena listened without interrupting. She did not ask for guarantees. She simply said, "I will wait for you, but only if you want to be here too." And at that moment, Jonathan realized that even though he had turned the page, he was still reading the paragraphs with fear. It was time to write something new, with confidence. She then decided to write a letter. Not to Emily, but to you. A kind of ritual. She recounted everything she felt, from the moment of betrayal to rebuilding her life with Helena. She exposed her doubts, her wounds, her anger, her grief, and also her relief at having survived all that. She folded the paper, put it in an envelope, and put it in a drawer in her new home. You didn't need to be read. You just needed to exist. Because sometimes, healing isn't found in talking to others, but in sincere dialogue with yourself. At the end of that week, Emily received a call from an editor interested in her design work. It was a small publisher in the countryside that was looking for someone with a knack for romance novel covers. They invited her for an interview. She flew in 2 days later. Upon arrival, she was greeted with kindness and respect, without judgment, without the burden of the city where everything happened. She presented her portfolio and was praised for her aesthetic sensitivity, her mature outlook, and the honesty of her lines. That was what they were looking for. She was hired. She rented a small house near the city center, with large windows and a simple garden. She began to walk in the morning, to observe the colors of the sky more closely. At night, she read the books she received from the publisher, and little by little, she began to rediscover the pleasure of being alone. One day, while organizing old files on his computer, he found a forgotten folder with wedding photos. For a few seconds, he hesitated to delete it. Then, he moved the folder to a flash drive and put it in a box at the back of his closet. Not out of attachment, but out of respect for what he had experienced. He decided that he didn't need to delete anything. He just had to stop carrying it around as a burden. He also started writing. Not to publish, but as a diary. He recorded feelings, advances, setbacks, thoughts. And there, in the words written by his own hands, he realized that he was becoming a different person, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. And for the first time, it didn't feel like punishment. It felt like growth. Jonathan and Helena decided to travel. They went to a coastal city where no one knew them, and spent a week away from everything. They walked barefoot on the sand, drank coffee in simple bakeries, watched the sunset in silence. It was all they needed: simplicity, presence, a new beginning. One night, lying in a hammock, Helena turned her face to him and asked, "Are you happy?" Jonathan didn't answer right away. He looked up at the sky, thought about everything he had experienced, and answered sincerely, "I am at peace. And that is better than happiness." Helena smiled, rested her head on his shoulder, and in that gesture there was a silent agreement. They both knew that life had its twists and turns, its losses, but that there was also beauty in rebuilding. On the morning of the wedding anniversary they would never celebrate again. Emily woke up with a knot in her chest. Not from sadness, but from memory. She didn't want to mark the date, but she felt she needed to make that day something different. She decided to visit a children's shelter in the rural area of the new city. She got some art supplies and offered a drawing workshop. She sat on the floor with the children, listened to stories, taught them shapes, and painted alongside them. At the end of the day, one of the girls, with her hair in braids, handed her a paper with a drawing on it, a smiling woman holding a heart. Emily thanked her with tears in her eyes. At that moment, she realized that life could still be beautiful, even after everything. That love could still exist, even without romance. That she was still capable of building. The decisions of the past still followed her. They always would. But now they were part of her story, no longer the definition of who she was. Emily finally understood that forgiveness was not forgetting. It was moving forward with awareness. And that, more than any excuse or second chance, was what made her free. And Jonathan, somewhere on the other side, knew it too. Because he had looked at the pain and chosen to walk. Because he had trusted again. Because, despite everything, he still believed in love. And in the end, perhaps that was what made their journeys so surprisingly human. The morning she decided to leave for good, Emily didn't cry. She dressed simply, tied her hair up as she liked to do before everything fell apart, and walked through the house one last time, her fingers gently running over the furniture, as if saying goodbye to every detail that had once been part of her old self. There was no longer a suitcase leaning against the door, no hesitation in her steps. The studio had already been handed over, the last commitments had been completed, and the city that had once served as the stage for her downfall was now just the backdrop for a silent rebirth. Before leaving, she wrote one last sentence in her diary: "The love I betrayed was the same one that taught me to love truly, too late, but not in vain." She closed the door without looking back and took with her only what was necessary, and what would never be lost again: consciousness. Emily arrived at her new destination without great expectations. She wasn't looking for applause or redemption. She just wanted time and space to be herself. She accepted a job offer at an NGO that developed artistic programs for at-risk teenagers. She started from scratch, with no prestigious resume, no status, no past to recommend her. But something about her caught people's attention, the way she listened, the way she looked people in the eye, as if she understood pain that didn't need to be explained. And it was true. She understood like no one else what it was like to get lost, to betray yourself, to find yourself without direction. She used her own story, without ever mentioning it, as a source of empathy and strength. In a short time, she became a respected name within the institution. Not for what she had been, but for what she allowed herself to become after the abyss. Jonathan, on the other hand, was about to get married again. The proposal had been made in a simple way, at an intimate dinner, where the eyes spoke more than any jewelry. Helena accepted with a smile full of meaning. Not because she expected it, but because she knew he wouldn't take such a step if he wasn't sure. The ceremony was discreet, surrounded by close friends and family, in a rustic house far from the city. There was no ostentation, no exaggerated promises. There was truth, maturity, and a type of love that is not born of charm, but of the conscious decision to walk alongside someone. During the vows, Jonathan didn't mention the past, but made it clear that he had learned, that he had fallen and that he now loved with open eyes. Helena held his hand firmly and there, in the middle of the field, amidst soft voices and a calm wind, the two sealed a story built not by the absence of pain, but by the courage to face it. Years later, Jonathan released a book of photography and memories. Images of places he had visited, people he had met, moments he had captured with an open heart. The book was not about betrayal or revenge. It was about rebuilding, about silence, about the beauty that exists in the gaps between chaos. One of the photos, placed on the back cover, showed a female silhouette sitting on a park bench, with a soft light enveloping her shoulders. It was Emily. Taken without her realizing it, on one of the last days before the separation. Next to the image, a simple caption: "Some losses teach more than 1,000 pieces of advice. And even if they cost us everything, they give us back what we should never have let die, the truth about who we are." The image was exhibited, praised, and aroused curiosity. But Jonathan never revealed who the woman in the photo was. She was no longer part of his life, but she would forever be part of his truth. Emily received a copy of the book in the mail, with no return address, but an anonymous note that simply said, "You were part of what made me grow. Thank you." She knew it was him. She smiled slightly, closed the book and put it on the shelf, among the few objects she chose to take with her. They never spoke again. They never crossed paths again. But there, in that silent exchange, they both knew they had closed the cycle with dignity. Emily's former boss, on the other hand, faced the most bitter consequences. He lost everything: his position, his respect, his reputation, his family. He tried to start over in other cities, but the traces of his conduct always caught up with him. Social media, forums for former employees, ongoing lawsuits. Little by little, he became a name associated with the worst abuse of power. No one trusted him anymore. No one wanted him around anymore. The game he had mastered with ease began to work against him. And even without arrest or formal punishment, his life became a prison without walls. Isolated, discredited, irrelevant. Fate, sometimes, takes its toll quietly, but with surgical precision. Helena and Jonathan had a relationship based on mutual respect. There was no daily euphoria, nor the need to prove feelings all the time. There was trust, space, and a type of complicity that comes from acknowledging the pain of others. They built a family together, with solid projects, with time dedicated to each other. Jonathan learned to love without fear. Helena learned to trust again. And together, they proved that even after a big fall, it is possible to get back up with more strength. The love between them did not erase the past. But it taught that the past does not need to be a prison. Emily later published an essay about choices. She did not sign it with her full name. She preferred to use only her initials. In the text, she talked about how small decisions shape our great destinies. How the moment we betray our values can be enough to crumble everything we have spent years building. And how, even after that, it is possible to get back up, but never in the same way. Her text went viral. It was shared, cited in lectures, and reached people who, like her, were searching for meaning after destroying what they loved. She never sought fame with it. She just wanted her pain to have some use. And, somehow, it did. This story did not have a happy ending in the conventional sense. There was no reconciliation. There was no outright forgiveness. But there was emotional justice. There was growth, rebuilding, truth. Jonathan continued to love in a different way. Emily learned to love herself. Helena found someone who valued her essence. And they all understood, in the harshest way possible, that betrayal is not just a momentary mistake, it is a silent earthquake that devastates everything around it. That destroys trust, corrodes homes, and leaves invisible scars that take years to heal. Now that this story has come to an end, leave your opinion in the comments. What would you do in Jonathan's place? Do you think Emily deserved a second chance? Or do you think fate was fair to each of them? We want to know how this story touched you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more intense, real and emotionally charged stories. Here, we do not support any type of betrayal. All stories are fictional and their sole purpose is to show how betrayal destroys families, wears down true feelings and marks lives irreversibly. And remember, trust is the foundation of everything. And once broken, it cannot always be rebuilt. May this story serve as a reflection so that love, when true, is protected, cared for and valued every day.